Joining us now to analyze today's headlines is Courtney Morris. She's an assistant professor of African American and Women's Studies at Penn State University. Hi, Courtney.
Hi, Sonali.
A day after the U.S. struck a historic deal with Iran, after decades of hostilities, the Republican Party predictably threw cold water on it. House Speaker John Boehner said the agreement is, quote, going to hand a dangerous regime billions of dollars in sanctions relief while paving the way for a nuclear Iran. If it's as bad a deal as I think it is at this point, we'll do everything we can to stop it, end of quote. President Obama seemed equally determined to pass the bill, saying, I will veto any legislation that prevents the successful implementation of this deal. This is not the time for politics or posturing. Tough talk from Washington does not solve problems, says the president. The deal, which delays Iran's ability to obtain a nuclear weapon by at least 15 years, needs to be ratified by Congress. A recent poll of Americans on the deal found that a slim majority, 51%, wants the U.S. to have diplomatic ties with Iran. Courtney, don't the Republicans risk looking like fools by refusing to pass this deal?
Well, quite possibly. I mean, it's apparent even at this early stage in the announcement that the negotiations have gone through that, the tide of public opinion, both nationally and internationally, has been overwhelmingly positive about this agreement. Several states in the Middle East, including Iraq and Oman, as well as several of our European allies, have stated very clearly their support for this deal. And there's also been a large amount of support from civil society, both in the United States and abroad, including from more progressive organizations. And I was reading this morning that the Institute for Policy Studies was talking about how important this deal is because it will not only allow the United States to keep an eye, or the international community rather, to keep an eye on nuclear development in Iran, but that it also really marks a turning point in our relationship with that country and in U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East. As we've seen in the last few years, the situation in the Middle East has completely deteriorated, and this kind of diplomacy really, presents the possibility that we'll be able to treat Iran as an ally in dealing with the problems that we have created in the region. So this is a hugely important deal and one that many people support, even if Republicans can't seem to get on board.
And just as Greece was agreeing to deal with Germany on solving its fiscal crisis through more cuts in exchange for cash, the International Monetary Fund this morning said it would not agree to a deal unless it included debt relief. The move throws a wrench into the EU's ability to strong-arm Greece. The IMF's report on Greece, called the Debt Sustainability Analysis, shows that the nation's debt will peak to about 200% of its income within just 2 years. The need for a writing off of at least part of Greece's debt is what Prime Minister Alexis Tsipras has been requesting for weeks. Greece's parliament votes on the plan today, but in an indication of how serious the split within the ruling Syriza party may be, Deputy Finance Minister Nadia Valvani has just resigned over the austerity package. She said, quote, it is impossible to continue being a member of the government. Now, Courtney, there's a split within Syriza, but might there also be a split within the group of creditors to Greece?
Absolutely. I mean, there's no clear agreement between member states of the Eurozone and institutions like the IMF. And it's been actually a bit refreshing to see that the IMF finally seems to be understanding that the gospel of free market fundamentalism doesn't actually work. We've seen that the outcomes of the austerity program in Greece have really been disastrous, and that the bailout that's being negotiated, I think, really has to develop a long-term strategy for allowing Greece to rebuild well, rather than focusing on the short-term goal of debt repayment. And many of the bailouts that Greece has received have focused almost exclusively on the repayment of debt, to the exclusion of cultivating more long-term strategies for economic growth in the country. And so this is an encouraging sign, although late from the IMF. It is encouraging to see that they are understanding that this is a problem. But of course, it still remains to be seen how all of this is going to play out in terms of whether Greece is going to accept the terms of the bailout that are set out by the Eurozone, and whether the Eurozone, particularly Germany, which is the most powerful actor in this whole situation, whether Germany is really going to allow debt relief to enter into the conversation.
Right. And finally, a judge ordered the release of a 2-year-old video of a shooting by Los Angeles police officers from the Southern California city of Gardena. The city paid $4.7 million in settlement to the family of Ricardo Diaz-Zeferino, who was killed by police. Media outlets like the LA Times sued for the video's release, and the city fought to prevent them from being made public. The video shows Mr. Zeferino and another man standing in place with their hands in the air. Apparently they were confused because one of them had actually called the police about a stolen bicycle. When the 3 officers in question arrived, they pointed their guns at the men and then shot Zeferino 8 times. The other man was also shot once but survived. The city attorney found no wrongdoing in the actions. Courtney, if it weren't for media outlets suing to get this video, we wouldn't see it. What do you make of this horrific incident?
I mean, there are really no words for this, but I think that, one of the things that we're finally beginning to see is that the movement that we've seen emerging over the last year, demanding more transparency, and accountability around the question of police abuse, is really bolstered by having access to these kinds of this kind of evidence, being able to see what the police are doing and what's actually taking place in these interactions with unarmed civilians, where unarmed civilians end up dead, and so. It's horrifying. I watched the video before the broadcast, and Mr. Zeferino just looks confused, really seems not to have a sense of what's going on, and then the police open fire on him and kill him. And so the fact that the the LAPD, or the Gardena, I'm sorry, PD needed to make a settlement with the families to deal with these deaths, with the death and with the wounding of the other man, really shows that there's a considerable interest by the public, that the public does have a right to know what's going on. These are taxpayer dollars that are being used to cover up the wrongdoing of police officers who are behaving in a manner that's completely inappropriate. And so it's a horrifying situation, but it is encouraging to see this information finally becoming available to the public.
Courtney, thanks as always for joining us. We'll talk to you again next week.
Bye, Sonali.
Courtney Morris is an assistant professor of African American and Women's Studies at Penn State University. This is Uprising. We'll be right back.